Professor Abramovich, thank you so very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. In your work, you have highlighted the increasing role of negative partisanship in American politics, where voters are driven more by opposition to the other party than by support for their own. You have especially discussed the significant role of racial resentment in shaping the voting behavior of white working class in 2016 election. Given the current demographic trends, how do you see this dynamic evolving in the upcoming 2024 election, particularly in the context of increasing diversity of the American electorate?
Well, I think we're going to see a continuation of this trend toward increasing polarization and negative partisanship. There's already a lot of evidence for that in the polling data that we have on the 2024 election. I think we'll see a lot more of it once we have access to data that will be collected after the election. But it's very clear that the messaging coming from the two major party candidates, particularly from Donald Trump, is emphasizing negative attacks, is emphasizing attacks on the opposition party and the opposition party's candidates. Portraying Kamala Harris, for example, as dangerously radical, portraying the Democratic Party as far, far to the left, trying to portray Harris and Democrats as a threat to the way of life of ordinary Americans, particularly the type of ordinary Americans who support Donald Trump. On the other side, I think we're also seeing quite a bit of negativity as well. The Harris messaging has included a larger share of positive messages as she tries to introduce herself to the American electorate, since she is not as well known as Donald Trump. But certainly it's also included a good deal of negative content, very critical of Donald Trump's positions on issues, but also very critical of Trump himself, his personality, his behavior, the fact that he has been convicted of criminal behavior, things like that. So given the negative attacks on both sides, given the very high level of mistrust that exists on both sides going into this election, and the dislike that we see of the opposing party and its candidates, I think we're going to see a continuation and possibly even an intensification of this trend toward negative partisanship.
All right. Can you give us a historical perspective into periods of intense political polarization in US history? What was so different in the Trump presidency?
Well, we've had periods of intense division and polarization in American history. Obviously, the Civil War was a period like that. In fact, the post-revolutionary period was a period of intense polarization in which the leaders of the two parties, in that case, the Democratic, Republicans, and Federalists, intensely disliked and mistrusted each other. But of course, the Civil War era probably is best known as the best known example of a time when the country was very deeply divided, so deeply divided over the issue of slavery that, in fact, the result was that a group of states seceded from the Union, and we had a very bloody Civil War. The last, I'd say, 20 to 30 years in American politics have brought us into another period of intense political polarization. Not necessarily one that will result in a civil war, but one that has resulted in a rise of intense dislike, vilification of the opposing party and its leaders, negative attacks by party leaders on those on the other side, a very divided media landscape as well, something that's contributing to this, where supporters of the two major parties tend to depend on different sources of information that reinforce the things they already believe. We don't have kind of a common base of knowledge the way we did, I would say, 30 or 40 years ago. So we're seeing this growing divide, and recently we're seeing how this can lead to outbreaks of violence. The most notable example of that, of course, being what happened on January 6, 2021, when a group of supporters of President Trump, prodded on by Trump himself, stormed the U.S. Capitol, engaged in a violent confrontation with police forces there, We had numerous injuries, several people who died as a result of that confrontation. So that is the most obvious example, but we've had other examples. We've had assassination attempts in recent months, two different assassination attempts on former President Trump. It's not clear exactly what the motives were of those individuals, but it's another reflection, I think, of the intense divisions that we see in the country today. And now going into the 2024 election, we have signals from the former president that he does not intend to accept the results of this election either if he is defeated, and that claiming that the only way that he could lose the election would be through fraud. In other words, the election would be stolen from him. So there is a real risk, I think, that we could see another outbreak of violence after the 2024 election, particularly if Trump loses the election. It may not take exactly the same form as it did in 2021, because we know that the federal government, the security forces, the Capitol Police will be much better prepared when those electoral votes are tabulated. So it probably won't take the same form, but there is certainly still a great concern about the risk of violence spurred on by the kind of rhetoric that we see emanating from former President Trump and some of his political allies, including his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance.
Your research mentions the role of partisan media in reinforcing negative partisanship. With the rise of social media and alternative news platforms, how do you see media influence evolving in shaping voter behavior? Are there any interventions that could mitigate the polarizing effects for media?
Well, I think the media environment remains highly polarized. For the most part, we see that those who support the Republican and Democratic candidates are getting their information from very different sources. Supporters of Vice President Harris and other Democratic candidates tend to get their information from what you might call mainstream media outlets, the major news networks, for example, outlets like CNN, and then outlets that have a clear liberal slant like MSNBC, whereas supporters of former President Trump and other Republican candidates tend to get their information disproportionately from sources that have a very clear conservative slant, particularly Fox News, but then other sites, online sites like, Newsmax, and other sources that have a very clear conservative slant. So they're getting their perceptions reinforced. They're getting their views of the election and of the candidates reinforced by the media messages that they're receiving. And particularly in the case of these right-wing media outlets, Fox News, most importantly, but then others as well, some are even more extreme than Fox News. A lot of this is misinformation. What we're seeing coming disproportionately from the right right now in the United States is the spread of misinformation by these sources, reinforcing some of the false claims that are being advanced by Mr. Trump, particularly claims about the 2020 election being stolen, claims about violence being perpetrated by immigrants, these sorts of things that are potentially quite dangerous. We don't see anything quite like that on the left. We're seeing, certainly there can be slanted news coverage coming from some media outlets on the left, like MSNBC and some of the liberal print media. But we don't see anything approaching the level of misinformation, and particularly the kinds of misinformation that can potentially lead to violence. We don't see that on the left to the same degree, or nearly the same degree that we see on the right.
You argue that Donald Trump's victory in 2016 presidential election was one of the most shocking upsets in American electoral history. Can you elaborate on the reasons why you label it as one of the most shocking?
Well, I think going into the election, the polling data that was available at that time indicated that Hillary Clinton was a very strong favorite. She seemed to not only have a pretty solid lead in the polls nationally, but also to be ahead of Trump, although by a narrow margin, in almost all of the swing states that would decide the election in the Electoral College. What happened, of course, was that we saw that the polls were off base, that there was an error, particularly in the swing states, so that in states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, where Clinton appeared to have a lead of at least 2 or 3 or 4 points, those states swung over to Trump by narrow margins, but nevertheless, that was what then tilted the Electoral College toward Donald Trump. So we have a situation here in the United States because of the role of the Electoral College. I refer to this as Electoral College roulette, in the sense that when the election nationally is relatively close, meaning within, say, 2 or 3 or even 4 points of margin, the election is going to necessarily come down to a small number of swing states that will determine the outcome in the Electoral College. And the margin in both 2016 and again in 2020 was much closer in those swing states than it was nationally, even though Joe Biden won the national popular vote by about 4.5 points in 2020, which one would normally expect to translate into a fairly easy victory in the Electoral College. What actually happened was that although his electoral vote margin appeared pretty comfortable, it actually was very narrow when you consider how close the election was in the swing states. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, North Carolina, the same 7 states that we think are going to also determine the outcome this time. So once again, we're approaching an election where Kamala Harris appears to have at least a modest lead nationally. On average, she's currently holding a lead of about 3 points nationally, maybe even a little bit more than that. But when we look at those 7 swing states, we see that the margin in those states is extremely close, which means that the outcome is sort of unpredictable. Harris could once again win the popular vote by a fairly comfortable margin, 2, 3, 4 points, fairly comfortable by recent American standards. And yet, of course, Donald Trump could still emerge as the winner in the Electoral College. So there's a decent chance of that happening again. Not predicting it, but it could happen again.
Do you consider Trump's presidency caused irreparable damage to American democracy?
Yes, I think it has done a lot of damage to American democracy. No other defeated presidential candidate in modern times has refused to accept the results of the election, and not only refused to accept the results of the election, refused to concede after the election, but actually actively sought to overturn the results of the election, tried to use to encourage his supporters in the swing states to overturn the results of the election, encourage the creation of slates of false electors in many of those swing states, and of course encourage the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. So all of these things were just very extraordinary. We have not seen anything like that in modern American history. No other defeated presidential candidate has behaved that way. And once again, we're facing an election in which Donald Trump is once again threatening to behave the same way, to refuse to accept the results of the election, and potentially to encourage violence by his supporters if he loses. He tends to use very violent language at times in talking about what would happen if he loses the election. So this is very worrisome, and I think it has done serious damage. Now, the divisions in American society and American politics didn't start with Trump. The deep divisions that we see really can be traced back over the past several decades as the two parties have become increasingly divided along ideological lines, and as issues that are highly emotional and divisive have emerged, issues like abortion and gay rights, along with the more traditional economic issues. So all of this has led to an intensification of political conflict. But Donald Trump came along and sort of took that as a starting point, was able to capitalize on that to gain control of the Republican Party, and then to win the presidency in 2016. And his presidency and now his post-presidency and the type of campaign that we see him running in 2024 is certainly exacerbating those divisions and greatly increasing the chances that those divisions will lead to some form of violence.
Can you explain how racial resentment, negative partisanship, and polarization under Trump's presidency shaped US politics and democracy?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons that Trump has been successful in appealing to this group of white working class voters in the United States is the fact that the country has been undergoing this very dramatic transformation over the last several decades, one that is ongoing in terms of its racial and ethnic makeup. So over time, the population of the United States is becoming increasingly diverse, and the share of the population, as well as the share of the electorate, made up of non-Hispanic whites, has been declining, and it's expected to drop below 50% within the next decade or two. It's already fallen below 50% in quite a few states, states like California and Texas, for example. So, this transformation is viewed as somewhat threatening to some members of the remaining white, the white population, which is actually not growing anymore and may start to decline in size relatively soon. There is a fear that the country is being taken over and run by people who are not like us, and by people who don't share our values. Trump capitalizes on this. Trump takes these divisions and portrays them as extremely threatening and dangerous. For example, in talking about immigration, Trump talks about immigrants as if they were criminals. They're coming from, he claims they're coming from prisons, they're coming from mental institutions, they're taking over cities, they're engaging in high levels of violence, even to the point where he claimed that Haitian immigrants in Ohio were killing and eating people's pet dogs and cats. Claim it's totally false. Nevertheless, he continues to promote this false claim and others. His vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, doing the same thing. Other Republican candidates either pushing the same lies or just not talking about it, refusing to actually distance themselves from or contradict what Trump is talking about. So clearly these sorts of claims are resonating with a share of the American electorate. Now, it's not a majority of the American electorate, but it is a substantial minority of American voters. And it is that group that scores highest on these measures of racial resentment. And by racial resentment, it's not just about African Americans. It's about the broader transformation of American society brought about by, for example, by immigration. The United States has been receiving very large numbers of immigrants over the last several decades. And, and so some of this is similar to what we see in Europe, the strains caused by immigration. Trump and other right-wing populist political leaders are capitalizing on that, capitalizing on the kinds of fears that many of the members of the formerly dominant white population, particularly those with lower levels of education, have, by portraying this as a threat to their way of life, as a threat to their economic well-being, as a threat to their values, and as literally a physical threat presented in the form of violence perpetrated by supposedly, by immigrants. So it's an important part of the messaging that we're seeing now from the Republican Party. And this is very different. This was, certainly not the case if you go back 30, 40 years ago. Even conservative politicians like Ronald Reagan, for example, were not talking about immigration that way. In fact, the traditional position of the Republican Party has been generally been pretty favorable, most of the time, and pretty favorable toward immigration.
Given your concerns about the risks of democratic backsliding in the United States, particularly under the influence of increasing polarization, what specific institutional reforms do you believe would help strengthen democratic norms and reduce the likelihood of further erosion?
Well, I think some steps have already been taken. I think some of the reforms that were enacted affecting the counting of the electoral vote, for example, trying to ensure that takes place more smoothly and is not subject to the kinds of attacks and disruptions that we saw after the 2020 election. But certainly other steps have to be taken at the state and local level. I think protecting election workers, ensuring that elections are conducted safely, and that the votes are counted accurately, and other steps to counteract the threat of violence. But I think in the longer run, one of the things that I think would be very helpful here in minimizing the chances of this sort of disruption would be abolishing the Electoral College entirely and going to a direct popular election of the president, something that we've been close to doing in the past, but now seems quite distant. Having a more direct connection, I think, between the popular vote and the choice of a president, I think, would reduce the chances for the kinds of manipulation and the kinds of attacks on the democratic process that we've seen in the last couple of elections, especially.
Do you attribute the reason of 2 assassination attempts on Trump to the effective polarization of American politics? What role did Trump play in deepening the polarization?
Well, I think Trump's been a major factor in deepening polarization with his rhetoric. His heavy emphasis on portraying the opposition party and its leaders as threats to democracy, as threats to the way of life of his supporters. So I think that has greatly exacerbated the divisions that already existed. It's hard to know what was on the minds of the individuals who tried to carry out these assassination attempts. But we tend to see things like that in times of deep division and polarization. And certainly Trump is a very divisive and polarizing figure, but I don't think we can assume that any future assassination attempts would be limited to him. Once people get this idea that it's possible to go out there and try to kill a political leader, we may very well see it coming from the other side. So, it's a very dangerous thing. And we just have to make sure that, it's important, obviously, to have adequate security for these candidates. I think they're now, taking steps to try to ensure that the candidates are safe when they're out there. But this country has a history of assassination attempts and several successful assassinations going way back. So this is really nothing. It's nothing new. It's just that the weaponry has gotten more sophisticated now, The access to these high-powered military-style weapons is another factor, I think, that is contributing to the risk here. So someone doesn't have to get very close to the president. In the past, to kill the president, or a candidate, you would have to get pretty close. Now you don't have to get close. You can do it from several hundred yards away if you get a clear view. And that's what we've seen in these last couple of attempts.
There are pundits who argue that a second Trump administration will damage more seriously the American democracy than the first one. Where do you stand in this debate?
Absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think we're seeing very clear signs when we look at what Trump and his supporters have in mind, that there would be serious attempts to undermine American democracy if Trump gets back in power. This was something he tried to do in his first term. He tried to go after his political opponents. He wanted to prosecute his political opponents, but he was restrained by the individuals around him who were in key positions, including some of his own advisors, the Attorney General, the head of the FBI, the heads of other security agencies, would not go along with what he wanted done. In a second Trump presidency, I think that would not be the case. We know that Trump has been searching, and his allies have been searching for individuals who would be much more willing to go along with his wishes, who would not restrain him if he gets back in the White House. So I think these attempts to pursue revenge, which seems to be his key motive for getting back in the White House, revenge against his political enemies, I think he would be much less restrained. And there's a great risk, in fact, that we could see serious attempts to prosecute individuals for nothing more than opposing Trump politically, including not just leaders of the opposition party, but also mass media outlets that have opposed Trump.
There are institutions like We-Dem, which argue that American democracy may not survive a second Trump administration. What will happen to American democracy and its liberal order if Trump re-elected on November the 5th?
Well, as I just said, I think that there's a great risk that that there would be a serious attempt to undermine American democracy, to undermine free and fair elections, for example, to use the power of the presidency and the executive branch of government to go after political opponents, to intimidate those who wish to oppose him. Now, there would also be a great deal of pushback. I have no doubt that these efforts to undermine American democracy and prosecute and attack political opponents would not be just met with acceptance. There would be strong opposition and pushback. Of course, another risk here is that this could ultimately lead to some form of violence. So I'm very worried about what that could lead to, and it's hard to predict what the outcome would be. I don't necessarily think it means the end of American democracy, but I think it means that there would be real threats to the integrity of elections, to the integrity of the Justice Department, to many government agencies that play an important role in the lives of Americans, having them politicized. Politicizing agencies, for example, even like the Federal Reserve. Trump has indicated he wants control. He doesn't want an independent Federal Reserve making decisions about things like interest rates. He wants someone there who would carry out his wishes. And, he might get that. And I think it would be very threatening, to the future of the American economy.
Lastly, Professor Abramowitz, you rightly predicted the result of 2020 presidential election by modifying time for change model. What is your prediction for November the 5th elections, maybe by using the incumbent referendum model?
Right. Well, in fact, I have used the original model to predict both the popular vote and the electoral vote. And the result is that the prediction is that Kamala Harris will win the election by a very narrow margin. by a margin of somewhere between 2.5 and 3 points in the national popular vote, and with 280 to 290 electoral votes. So that's a very close margin, and that means that there's a good deal of uncertainty about the prediction. When you have a margin that close, whether it's in a poll or in a forecasting model, it means that you can't have a high degree of confidence about the results. So I would say that the chances are better than 50-50 that Kamala Harris will win this election, but not that much greater than 50-50. If we were choosing the president based on the national popular vote, I would say that there's probably a 90% chance that Harris will win. But we're not choosing the president by the popular vote. We're choosing the president by the electoral vote. And as I've explained, because of the fact that the swing states are actually more competitive than the nation overall, I think that it's entirely possible that Kamala Harris could win the national popular vote, but lose the electoral vote. I'm not predicting that, but I think that there is a reasonable chance that that could happen.
Professor Abramovic, thank you so very much. Appreciate your time.
Sure, glad to be with you.